All right, frame generation, fake frames. Do you use them? This is Robocop, and it's a fairly demanding game, although I say that, and of course in this section we're getting like 75 frames per second. And this is maxed out. So this is literally everything on Epic, the Epic preset. So not the best example. This game seems to only slow down when, there's enemies shooting at you and there's all those like particle effects happening when your shots, where they hit, sparks fly. So yeah, this part of the game, despite looking really good, there's lots of reflections on the street and the cars. Yeah, it looks really nice, but it's actually not that demanding compared to some of the other parts of the game. So here I really wouldn't want to use frame gen. If it's already running at like 75 frames per second, what's the point? But we can turn on frame gen here and we'll see that now we're at like 120, 125 frames per second. So not quite doubled. Sometimes the frame generation will double your frame rate. I find in this game anyways, when my frame rate's lower. Like if it's at 55, it will double it up to 110. But when it's at 75, it's not quite doubling it up to 150. But again, this part of the game is just not that demanding. And so honestly, at this point in the game, I'm like, well, no, I wouldn't use frame gen. I mean, if I'm already getting 75 frames per second, then I'm not going to use frame gen. But that's just this part of the game. So if we skip forward a little bit, this part of the game, surprisingly, at first it doesn't look... Well, see, it's fine now. We're 70 frames per second. Despite this area not really looking as impressive, with all the neon lights and reflections. But as soon as guys start shooting, as soon as the action kicks in, you're going to see it drop down to probably 55 frames per second or so. Yeah, like 50 frames per second. Especially when this machine gun starts shooting at you. It'll drop below 50 frames per second. So here, if we restart from checkpoint, and now turn on frame gen, this is kind of the ideal spot where you would want to use frame gen when you're running at like 50 frames per second. You don't want your base frame rate to go too low because your input latency is still going to be based on your base frame rate. But at 50 frames per second, like the input latency still felt okay. Obviously, it could be better. But yeah, as you can see now, we're at like 100 frames per second when we were at 50 before. Or 90 when we were at 45 before. Again, especially when this machine gun starts shooting at us. Yeah, we're still holding like 80 frames per second, where it was dropping down into the 40s before. So yeah, it effectively doubles the frame rate, especially, again, when your frame rate's kind of in the 50, 60 range. We'll load up another area in the game. I'll turn off frame generation. And we'll load up, I don't know, this is, I think, the police station here. The police station's actually pretty demanding, despite there's no action. This is not, no, this is not the police station. Although, what are we getting here? 60 frames per second?
It'd be easier to burn it up all to the ground.
Yeah, 65. It is 60 there, so if we turn on frame gen now, it should jump up to about 120. $107, 110, 120, yeah, okay. So it can effectively double your frame rate, and of course, if you know what frame gen does and how it works, that makes sense. It's basically, generating a fake frame in between every other real rendered frame. So it renders a frame and then it generates a fake frame, and then it renders a frame and then it generates a fake frame. So putting in a generated frame in between every real frame. So yes, in theory, it should double your frame rate. Of course, if there's some overhead or your CPU is being the bottleneck, it's, you know, there, as we saw in some areas, it's not going to double. But when it's around 50 to 60, it does seem to double the frame rate. And so, honestly, in this game, under these circumstances, running it, you know, again, everything on Epic, it kind of makes sense, you know. Initially, I've always kind of been against frame generation. And in a lot of cases, I don't see the point. If the game's running at 100, do I really need it to run at 200, for example? And in competitive games, you know, again, you're not really lowering your input latency the same way that you would be if your base frame rate was higher. And I think, you know, another issue with frame gen, for me anyways, is just... one of these is the police station. Here we go. Yeah, the police station, like I said, I found this area to be run a little bit slower. There's a lot of, I guess there is like a lot of NPCs just kind of hanging around in here. So yeah, as you can see, even in this non-action scene, you know, we're in the 60s, 65 frames per second there. And again, we can turn on frame gen. And pretty much doubled. 110. We went from 65 to 110. Or 60. Oh, I guess, yeah, that's not doubling. Well, 115. It's almost doubling. And honestly, I don't notice any visual downgrade. You know, with frame gen, with the fake frames will have some artifacting in them. The fake frames won't be perfect. They are taking into account motion vectors, so they kind of understand, you know, the way that the camera's panning, and it has to take all that into account to make the fake frame, because it has to kind of guess what the next frame is going to look like. But again, it's not perfect, and so in theory, using frame gen can lower your image quality. But honestly, in this game, I don't notice it. You know, I notice more of a visual downgrade using FSR than I do using FrameGen. And if FrameGen means I can use FSR on quality instead of, you know, balanced or performance, that could equal better image quality at a better frame rate. You know, other than just turning some settings down. But again, if we are running at, like, say, medium settings or high settings and getting the same frame rate as if we can run on Epic settings and use FrameGen, if we're not really losing any image quality using FrameGen, but now we can have the visuals on Epic, then yeah, we're actually getting better visuals. So yeah, FrameGen, you know, again, I used to always be very much so against frame generation, fake frames. But I think in the right game, under the right circumstances, it can be a tool that's worth looking at. It is a tool. It's there for you to use it. If you want to use it, great. If you don't want to use it, great. I've always understood, you know, some people like FrameGen, some people don't. And that's fine. If you want to use it, go ahead. In a game like this, where it's a fairly demanding, you know, Unreal Engine 5 game, and, you know, you're running at 50... say 50 to 60 frames per second, and you want to double that up, honestly, go for it. You know, it's not going to hurt anything. But again, if your base frame rate is too low, then you don't want to rely just on FrameGen because your input latency will still be based on that lower frame rate. So the game will still feel a little bit sluggish. You might feel like you have a little bit of input lag, even though visually it looks smoother. So in that case, you know, you'd want to turn some graphical settings down. So really all comes down to a balance. The resolution you're running at, how much upscaling do you want to use, what's your base frame rate, and, you know, what visual quality presets do you want to use. So, yeah, I mean, FrameGen is what it is. It's there. It's a tool if you want to use it. I think in some games it makes sense. Single-player games with demanding graphics, you know, Cyberpunk. if you want to play Cyberpunk and you want to have, Cyberpunk's not that demanding. It's not as demanding as people think it is until you start turning up ray tracing. If you turn up the ray tracing to the higher settings, it can get pretty demanding, and that's the kind of game where you might want to use frame generation. As long as, again, you're not noticing any, degradation in image quality, why not? Why not use it if it's a tool there for you? So yeah, again, initially I was kind of against frame generation, fake frames. And I understand the argument that your frame rate's going up, but your input latency is staying the same. And so I get that. I get the limitations. But again, in certain games, under certain circumstances, you may want to use it. And so, yeah, I may be changing my mind a little bit on frame generation. So there you go. It's there. I'm not going to use it in most games, especially, again, if my base frame rate, if I've got the visuals where I want them to be, and my base frame rate is, 75, 80 frames per second, I really don't need to increase it. I don't really notice much of a difference, personally, between, say, 80 frames per second and, like, 120 or 130, as we saw here when we were out in the streets. We'll go back to the... We'll go back to one of the streets. And yeah, so again, did we try this area here? Lots of flashing lights with turn off frame generation. And yeah, we're back into the mid 60s, right? Yeah. 65 frames per second. And of course, doubling that should give us, what, 130? So again, it's not 100%. There's clearly some overhead happening there sometimes. The higher the frame rate is, maybe, the more overhead there's going to be for frame generation to do its thing. But yeah, it's bringing us up to 115, 120 instead of like 65. But yeah, it's not a hugely noticeable thing for me in a single-player game. If it's running at 60, 80. I'm usually okay with that, but as we saw in the once people started shooting at us and the sparks started flying, and it was dropping down to 55, then yeah, I would definitely want to have frame generation on. Again, my options are turn frame generation on, or turn some of these graphical settings down, or turn the FSR upscaling basically down or up, make it more aggressive. From quality to balanced or to performance. And, FSR on performance doesn't look great. I always like to use FSR on quality. I don't like to go below quality. And yeah, in some of these settings you can turn down and, visually you're probably not going to notice any difference. In fact, the funny thing is in this game, let me just show you here, I'm going to turn off frame gen. And, so let's say we're getting 65. Well, see, it is dropping below 60 here. But a lot of times 65 to 70. And if we turn down if we turn down this to high, you would think that would make a pretty big difference. But, well, we're getting 80 now. So, okay, made a fair difference. And do I notice much of a visual difference from between high and epic? No, not really. So again, it's really going to come down to the game, what kind of graphical settings you're capable of running, and what resolution you're running at. And there's a lot of variables there, right? There's a lot of things to consider. Where you may want you may want to use frame gen, or you may want to, result to some other way if you can get your frame rate up. But, again, getting your native frame rate or your base frame rate up is always going to help input latency. So you got to keep that in mind. So it's all a balance, as always, trying to find the right graphical settings, the best graphical settings for you. And that is going to come down to the individual and, of course, the individual game. So yeah, I just wanted to show that, talk about frame gen a little bit. I'm kind of changing my mind on it a little bit. I think sometimes it makes sense and is really just going to depend on the game and the kind of graphical fidelity that you're trying to get in that game. So I guess that's it, guys. See you later.